With Dr. J. Todd Brown of Grand Rapids, Michigan, and the interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Okay, now can you start us off with some background on yourself, and to begin with, where and when were you born?
I was born July 5th, 1964 in Peoria, Illinois.
Okay, did you grow up in Peoria or did you move around?
I did not. My dad took a job early in my life in Rochester, New York, and we moved to upstate New York when I was 2.
Okay, and what kind of work did he do?
My dad was a Korean War veteran and came back after the Korean War and went to school at Bradley University in Peoria, met my mom there, and then got into business and was in the printing industry on the administrative side for his whole career.
Okay, so printing isn't like Rochester, New York, like Xerox?
It was Xerox.
Weren't they the enemy?
He printed, that was printing for forms.
Mm-hmm.
He was in printing of manufacturing labels, boxes, and things like that. So
Okay.
Morton Salt and Peter Pan and Jolly Green Giant and those kind of companies.
All right, and let's see, obviously you could, and so when did you finish high school?
I finished, well, it was interesting. My dad, I went to 3 high schools in my 4 years. First 2 were in Rochester in a private Catholic school. And then I went to a public school in Rochester, and then my dad's company transferred him here to Grand Rapids.
Okay.
And I finished up at East Grand Rapids, but only went there for 1 year. So,
All right.
3 separate high schools in 4 years.
Okay, and then, and what year did you graduate?
1982.
Okay, and then once you graduated from high school, what did you do?
First 2 years I was new to Grand Rapids, new to the area, so I went to Grand Rapids Community College, CC back in the day, or JC back in the day. Yeah. And went there for 2 years and followed on from that to Aquinas. Along the way, joining the Marine Corps, Marine Reserves, in between my sophomore and junior year in college, and went off to boot camp, and then came back. When I came back from boot camp, I went to Aquinas for 3 years. Although in the end of it, I had classes at Grand Valley as well before going to medical school. So I essentially attended, I guess, three colleges along the way.
Okay, what motivated the decision to join the Marine Corps?
I have always had a pride in service of the country. It's been deeply rooted in me. My dad talked proudly of his time in Korea and serving in the Army. And I knew at the time that I wanted to join. I wanted to join the most elite fighting force, and I joined the Marine Corps.
All right, and of course there was a guard unit based in Grand Rapids, so that's
Yeah, it made it easy.
convenient enough to do. Okay, so then you've done 2 years of college, and now you go off to boot camp. And where do they send you for boot camp?
San Diego, California.
Okay, describe what that experience was like. What kind of reception do you get when you go down there?
It's a very regimented. It's like you've seen in the movies. It's chaotic and mayhemish, and the technique of shaving your head off and making you become part of a unit, breaking you down and building you up as a team, and the evolution of that was very interesting. And I was relatively mature. By the time I actually got to boot camp, I turned 21 in boot camp. And so that 2 or 3 years from kids that were as young as 17 in my training was a big difference, and so it was an interesting experience for me. I enjoyed it.
Enjoyed Marine Corps boot camp.
Mm-hmm.
It happens occasionally, but not often. When you got there, I mean, in the Vietnam era, the standard practice was to bring the guys actually onto the depot in the middle of the night.
Mm-hmm. Still hadn't changed. Everybody arrives at night, and you're up, 24 hours or 36 hours really that first day. So you really are quite confused and chaotic and not knowing where you're at and what you're doing next. Kind of a time frame.
Okay. How much time do you actually spend with the processing, and how quickly do you start getting into actual training?
I forget the timelines exactly at this point, but I remember being at least a week that you're in processing, essentially forms and drawing equipment and boxing up your personal equipment, your personal clothes and things. It seemed like it was at least a week. I don't remember exactly.
Had they done all the aptitude tests earlier, or do you get those?
Yeah,
too?
that was all done. You do some, but you had done all your basic aptitude tests before you got in there.
All right. And now when you start to train, do drill sergeants at any point treat you at all differently because you're older, or expect different things of you, or are you just the
No,
same as
just
the rest?
another person, yeah. No real change or difference with that.
Okay. And to what extent are they still trying to sort of play games with your head, or?
Looking back on it, it's quite clear, the first 4 weeks is you're treated one way, the second 4 weeks are treated a little bit better, and then by the end they're building you up rather than breaking you down. So it really is an evolution of time. The first 4 weeks are very regimented, very controlled, and a lot of just sort of general mind games.
Okay. Now, were you prepared for that? Had you heard about that before and had some idea what they were doing?
Not as much before. No, I mean, it's ironic. Back in the day, make you feel old, but there wasn't such a thing called the internet.
Mm-hmm.
So it was really more story and whether you read some books, but you couldn't go look up YouTube on what boot camp will be like, which you can easily now, and I have watched them, and they're very accurate to what the reality is. Like SEAL training and much of the other things, you can see quite a bit about what it's like now. Before it's more about lore and hearsay, but you can't really see it or feel it directly.
All right. Now, were there other guys you were training alongside who were having trouble with it?
Oh, there's a fairly significant washout rate, yeah, throughout the course. I can't remember the numbers, but there, I remember clearly one episode, and sort of late in our training actually, where one of the recruits threw his M16 at the drill instructor on the parade deck when we were being drilled. And I remember that being a very meaningful and eventful occasion for which we all were punished for a period of time. And he was no longer with us. So.
Right. Did you have a sense of why the other recruits were there? I mean,
no, you don't really have a lot of free time to really talk about. I couldn't even name one person from my
Mm-hmm.
boot camp days. So there's really zero free time to sort of commiserate or talk much about it. And sort of when you leave, you go your separate ways and you're on about your next thing. So not really. I'm sure everybody has their own reasons, but
yeah. Now, do you know if these were all going to be reservist or guards people? Or?
It was mixed. There was a summer evolution, so there was a fairly heavy reserve college group that was there at that particular time. But it was mixed between active duty and reserves.
Okay, so they weren't segregating out the reserves from everybody else. You were in the same companies.
All one
things
boot
like
camp.
that.
Yep.
Okay, all right. So how long did that training last?
That was 12 weeks.
Okay. Now, at that point, you just go home?
Go home. Yeah.
Okay. Now, was there another stage that you would get later on?
There's a second stage that, ironically, I never got to. The Advanced Infantry Training School was the second stage of that in Camp Pendleton. I came back and in process through my unit, and then through a series of training evolutions here, I never got back to ATS. So.
Okay. Now, can you tell somebody what a training evolution is?
Just periods of time of when you're doing different things. In the reserves, you train essentially 1 weekend a month back in those days, and then 2 weeks in the summer. And my unit actually was activated one time during my 3 years. We got called to duty, and I believe it was. I think it was either the El Salvador time frame when things were getting heated up that the Russians were building up towards El Salvador, and so we had a show of force and we built up, and our unit got activated and transferred off to we went to went down to North Carolina, Camp Lejeune.
Mm-hmm.
So we spent 2 weeks down there, and it was actually in the middle of the winter. It was in December-ish time frame, and crawled around the swamps and came back. They never went anywhere beyond that.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Okay. But then, did you just accumulate enough practical experience that they didn't think they needed to send you?
So that was like I passed through this one summer because it was always going to be in the summer because they try to do it during your college break.
Right.
So I passed through a summer. The following summer I had an ankle injury, so they passed me on that one. And then the third summer, I was close enough to getting out, and I actually ended up, since I was separated, and I was actually finishing college sort of at the same time frame. And basically my CEO gave me the choice, sign up and continue on, or don't go to ATS but get out. So I separated at 87.
All right. And sort of were you satisfied with the Marine Corps experience at that point, or did you think?
I was at that point, yes. Yeah, I was satisfied at that point. In the meantime, I had applied for Officers Candidate School for the Marine Corps. That
Okay.
was my first career choice, actually. And it was around the timeline that Reagan didn't pass the budget and the Grand Ruggman Act went into effect and actually cut the class that I was in for OCS. And so that was, I forgot, that was actually one of those summer timeframes that kind of came and went as I was going to go on OCS at the end of my 4th year of college. And so it made me rethink. I remember having a meeting. It was a little ironic. My wife, my now wife, who was girlfriend at the time, was going to night school at Aquinas. And she was going to school for teaching with a guy who was an officer in the unit. And so she had talked to this gentleman and said, my boyfriend was, trying to get into OCS, and it got passed, for that summer. And so through this whole conversation, it turns out that the guy that she was talking to was my company commander, who happened to be going to night school to be a teacher, Captain Cheslick at the time, I remember that. And so I ended up having this informal meeting with Captain Cheslick, who was my CO, who I had never spoke to prior to this occasion, and kind of laid the whole thing out. And he said, well, do you have another idea what you'd want to do if you don't go to OCS? And I said, well, I've always contemplated going into medicine. And that started the process of, well, if you didn't get an OCS, that's when they said, well, let's just forget about ATS, Advanced Infantry School, or AIS. And I ended up getting out in 87 after my 5th year of college, because I had needed another year to get prerequisites for medical school, because through the first 4, I actually wasn't considering medicine. So it's kind of a weird evolution that this, quote, friend of my girlfriend's at the time's, at night school happened to be my company commander.
Great. Okay. Yeah, so they did make it complicated, but in the end you decided you're going to go to med school?
Yeah, I went a different way, yep.
And so where did you go for med school?
So I went to Kirksville Osteopathic in Missouri, which was the first DO school in the country. So moved off to there in 1988. So there was a year gap from when I finished up Aquinas and started medical school the following summer.
And Kirksville is sort of northeast Missouri?
Northeast corner, yep, kind of out in the middle of nowhere, which is a perfect place to go to school.
Not a lot of distraction.
Not a lot of distraction, no.
All right. And medical school is 3 years normally?
It's 4 years of medical school. 2.5 of it is on campus, and 1.5 years of it is clinical rotations, some of which I did here in town in Grand Rapids, some in Pennsylvania, some in Ohio.
All right. And at what point did you start thinking about going back into the military?
Shortly thereafter, getting my orthopedic residency, I looked to go back into the military and had missed it at the time and wanted to get back into it. It was kind of not spur of the minute, but there was a luncheon, literally. The guy came to the hospital recruiting, and there was a Navy guy and an Air Force guy, and I went up to the Navy guy and I said, can you send me to SEAL school as a physician? And he said no, and I said, well, forget it. And I said, talked to the Air Force guy, I said, will you send me to flight school if I joined the Air Force? And he goes, oh, you have a chance to go to flight school. So I chose the Air Force, and that was literally the thought process level of joining. But I knew I was going to join one of the two. So.
All right. And now, once you sign up, I mean, what does that entail in terms of what do they do for you and what do you do for them?
So I signed up, mid-residency. Orthopedic residency is 5 years, and I was trying to think. It's around my 3rd year or so that I signed on with the Air Force, and they provided a stipend to the residency to pay my salary, and I owed them. It must have been my 3rd year. End of my 2nd year or 3rd year, because they paid for 3 and I owed them 4. So it was the bottom line. So they paid for 3 years of my residency, and I owed them 4 years of active duty. During my residency itself, I did nothing with the military. There was no meetings or essentially anything like that until you finish your residency. So.
Okay. And so when did you finish the residency?
So I finished the residency at the end of June of 1997. And from there you go to Officers Candidate School, Montgomery, Alabama for the Air Force. And I don't remember exactly when I started, but it was just a few weeks later, moved down to Alabama.
Okay. So how do they do OCS for the Air Force, and how does that compare, if at all, to what you had out of the Marine Corps?
Yeah, exactly, no comparison at all. It's much more like a college, essentially, with some degree of physical fitness. We did do some running, some volleyball, but nothing really strenuous. It was all Officer Candidate School for health. It was all
Okay.
nurses and doctors and anesthesiologists and things along that lines. It's private rooms, it's suites, air conditioning, and
All right.
day work, no night or weekend work. So
Okay. And now, did you have women as well as men training in this?
yeah, mixed. Yeah,
About what balance do you think there was?
seemed like there's more women just off the top of my head, but I don't really remember that exactly.
Do you have a sense that they were mostly nurses, or a fair number of doctors? Or?
There was it was about mixed between nurses and
Okay.
doctors. Yeah, about almost half and half.
Okay. Now, back when you were in the Marines, I mean, were there women around at different points, or was it all male for what you were doing?
All male. Yeah, there was no women. There were women in the Marine Corps, but nobody that was anywhere near any male training facilities.
Right.
The only women that you really saw is if when you went to the dental clinic for the Navy, you'd see female dental assistants, and that was about it.
Okay. All right. So, I don't know, how long do they keep you for OCS for the Air Force?
I can't remember exactly. It seemed like it was about a month, not real long. Teach you how to wear your uniform and fill out forms and in process basically paperwork and some military history and etiquette and some of those things that for those that had no service was something. For me, it was not a whole lot.
Okay. Once you finish with that, now, what do they do with you?
So I went to somewhat of a unique scenario. I went from there to Little Rock Air Force Base. So fresh out of my residency, I moved to Little Rock Air Force Base as a only orthopedic surgeon on the entire base. So essentially went into solo practice in the Air Force in a clinic with other physicians around, but was the only orthopedist there. So
And how much business did you get?
a ton. Yeah, being the only guy, essentially you had all of it. So it was primarily a sports medicine practice, the shoulders and knees and ankles and the routine active people kind of injuries. We didn't do a lot of trauma, true trauma business, but busy from the sports medicine side.
Okay. And was it literally sports medicine, and that's how they got themselves hurt, or just a kind of injury?
It's a kind of injury, although the majority of the injuries were sports related. Yeah, I mean, there was some pilot. Little Rock Air Force Base is the home of the C-130 training base for all branches, actually. And so any service has 130s of pilots come through Little Rock Air Force Base. So there was a fair bit of some flight line injuries, which are more strains and sprains and things like that. But the rest of it really was sports-related injuries.
All right. And I don't know, how does it compare working in that kind of clinic as opposed to a civilian hospital or practice like yours now?
It's different. There's a different level of camaraderie in the military. Still a level of camaraderie I miss today. There still is a sense of an important mission other than just surgery or just whatever the technical part of your life is. And I still think it's somewhat of a privileged job. People tend to want to get better. It's a unique form of medicine.
All right. And so how long did you spend in Little Rock?
Little Rock was 2 years. Due to the size of the clinic, they actually downsized much of the orthopedic. Well, me being the only orthopedic care, they downsized orthopedics, but they downsized surgery altogether and moved in to the civilian world. So I got moved at that point to Scott Air Force Base.
Okay. Now, are there particular events or things that kind of stand out in your memory about the 2 years in Arkansas? If you think back to that, what do you think of?
it was a learning experience for me from a medical standpoint. You're going from a training world of residency to having to think for yourself completely without relying on anybody, any colleagues essentially around you to learn from. So it was a rapid growth phase as far as my medical practice and medical knowledge goes.
All right. Okay, so you do that. You did it for 2 years, and then on to Scott Air Force Base, and where exactly is that?
Scott's outside of St. Louis, Illinois,
Okay.
on the Illinois side.
Yeah, so I guess it was near East St. Louis, or
O'Fallon, Illinois is the actual
Yeah.
town, yeah.
okay. And then what kind of facility was that? Was that bigger than Little Rock, or?
So a bigger hospital. I joined a number of orthopedists there, became one of 5 or 6 orthopedic surgeons, and it was a busier hospital setting. Had a transfer center, so we actually got stuff from overseas that was being shipped back. So it was a much busier hospital scenario, and somewhat unique in that I had partners again.
Right. And what were there particular units that were based there? I mean, you had C-130s in Little Rock, or what do you have in East St. Louis?
St. Louis was the medical transfer unit, as well as the smaller carrier jets. So.
Okay. Of course, one thinks of carrier jets usually as being with the Navy.
Yeah, no, this is just small
Just-
private jets, almost little leaders.
Oh, that kind of small
So,
carrier.
Yeah.
All right.
So it's a home of the Air Mobility Command. So there's a lot of command offices there, a lot of general staff and whatnot, but not as much, actually not as busy a flight line as Little Rock had.
Okay. And you said that you've got a different kind of mix of injuries that you dealt with there.
Well, still for the most part, sportsy kind of related injuries, and it's more just based on the fact of the age of the clientele that you're working on. So.
All right. Now, at the very end of your time there, 9/11 happens, but before that, again, if you're thinking about the time you're serving there and the things that you're doing, what sort of stands out in your mind about that?
The big highlights for me of Scott was when I in-processed into the Scott Air Force Base, the master sergeant who was in charge of the hospital was a forward air commander by specialty, and it had an injury, so he was off the field from that and doing hospital-based work. And so when he looked at my records as I came in, I was an orthopedic surgeon with prior field Marine experience. He began became fairly friendly and wanted to know to what degree I wanted to get back into or enjoyed field operations. And still having the youth that I did back in those days, found myself through his connections through the special ops world, going through Army Airborne School and Army Air Assault School. So through the short 2 years I was there, found myself jumping out of planes and rappelling out of helicopters and doing things that most orthopedists weren't doing. And that was clearly my highlight of my time in the total Air Force, really, was more the operational things I got to do.
Yeah, and where did you go to jump school?
Jump school's in Fort Benning at that time. I think it's still true. There's only one jump school, essentially. It's all through Fort Benning, no matter what service you're in.
Yeah, and how long does that?
That's a 3-week course.
Okay, and how do they run it? I mean, what stages do they go through for that, or how do they do it?
Similar to Marine basic training, but much more, it's more academic. Airborne school itself is not quite as physical. Air Assault School actually was more physical than Airborne School. But they're teaching how to fall out of a plane essentially and be able to land with minimal amount of injury. So that although you do some running and some jumping and there's the typical military games that they play, I was even at that time I was probably in my early 30s, going through as a captain at the time. So one of the highest, I remember through Airborne and Air Assault, the only guy who outranked me actually was the training battalion commander, who was Lieutenant Colonel. So I was a fairly high-ranked person going through, Airborne and Air Assault School, which I really didn't have a jump billet or any true job related to that, other than I had a good connection.
Yeah.
So,
All right. And as you're doing this, are you wondering if you're going to become one of your own patients?
No, never really crossed my mind. To be honest, I enjoyed it. So
Okay, it's the sort of thing where, now, did jump school, did that generate a lot of the kind of injuries that you would otherwise treat?
it would on an Army base. Other than the fact that I wasn't attached to a airborne unit,
Right.
I didn't see them as much in Little Rock. And a little bit that was how we got it passed for me to go, was that if you needed to see the injuries from the medical side, then maybe it's not a bad idea to go through it and learn how to do it yourself. So that was kind of what we used to get through it. So
All right. Now, your timing of things, you get out, you're scheduled to complete your time in the service or the end of,
Yep.
of September in 2001. Now, do you remember sort of what you were doing or what happens when 9/11 happens, kind of where you were?
So it was an interesting period because I was out processing from the military through August of 2001, and the program I had gone through to get into the Air Force, I had a large student loan debt, and I met with then the incoming Surgeon General to the Air Force. He was a one-star, and I can't remember his name now, but he actually happened to be at Scott Air Force Base at the time, because he was a flight surgeon. I can't remember his name, but and I met with him, and I said, I'll give you 4 more years if you assume my student loans. And at that time, the program didn't exist. The program now does exist. So essentially, I couldn't afford to stay on active duty. I didn't make enough money to pay my student loans. And so really that was the thought process, was I'd like to stay. At the time, my friend's next opportunity he had set up for me was to go to Ranger School. And so if I could have gotten 1 more year, I could have gotten off to Ranger School. And so, I was moderately disappointed in the evolution of not really sort of being able to stay. And it was interesting that, like I said, now the program exists to be able to, to fill that gap. Because that was the hard thing. But for physicians, the people that tended to stay around were ones that had academy commitments. So by the time you add your academy time plus your 6 years of commitment plus your medical school and residency, their minimum commitment time ended up being close to 16 years. But short of that, majority of the physicians all got out and went into private practice. So.
Okay. So where were you? What were you doing when you heard about 9/11?
So 9/11, I had already out-processed through that process. So right there towards the end of August, and I was in my spine fellowship. So I was in Springfield, Illinois, still on active duty, living on base, but had started my civilian training year right at the end of August, like August 30th, September 1st, and was sitting in a lounge room for the orthopedic residents when I saw the planes, hit the towers, and I was about an hour and a half from base, and had to come back to base and sort of check back into the hospital, which of course at that time there was nothing going on in Scott Air Force Base, but other than when you pulled up to the gate now, there were Humvees with 50 cal machine guns on the top of them. So it looked different and it felt different. There was no work that was really different at that time.
All right. But you're still scheduled to get back out. So was there any, at that stage, were they thinking about, let's encourage people to stay in, or were they just trying to deal with the situation in front of them?
No, it was pretty much, after 2 days back, they said, you can go back to your training, we know where you're at, and then that's when Congress began the conversation about stop loss, and they enacted the stop loss to start October 1 of 2001. My date of separation was September 30th was the end of my contract, so I was able to get out.
Okay. At that point, once all this stuff happens, did you have a part of you that said, well, really, I ought to find a way to stay in anyway, or was it just not practical for where you were?
It wasn't practical at the time to stay, so I didn't really go through that a whole lot. So, what I always said is, if I got reactivated, I'd be happy to go back on active duty. still would probably.
Now, do you stay on some kind of reserve status after you get out? Or?
You know, I've heard rumor that you stay on as a physician up to 55, actually. So I don't know whether that's true or not true. No one contacts me or anything, but I would imagine I'm on a shorter list than somebody else.
Right. All right. So to look back now at that university combination of time that you spent in the service, what do you think you took out of it, or how did that affect you?
You know, what I take out of it is a pride. I was a pride in the country and pride of service, and I still have it. You know, like I said, I'd be thrilled to still go back on active duty, particularly if I could get into some of this more special ops world. Now over 50, I suspect that's zero. So I've enjoyed it. I thought it was a very privileged, unique environment to be in, particularly in medicine, because it's so different than civilian medicine, where there really doesn't seem to be a commitment to a different mission or a different greater good, you know, where you definitely feel connected in a different way in the military.
All right. Well, it's not the longest interview I've ever done, but you've said quite a bit in this small amount of time. So I'd like to thank you very much for sharing your story today.
Thank you much.
All right. And that is a wrap.
All right, thanks.
And all the people staring at us.